The restaurant was her choice. She picked it 3 weeks in advance, sent me the confirmation email with a little note attached. Can't wait. Just us. I saved that email, not because I thought I'd need it later, just because it made me feel like we were still the kind of couple who looked forward to things. We had been married for 8 years that night. 8 years of shared bank accounts, Sunday routines, inside jokes that had long stopped being funny, but we still said anyway. 8 years of building something I believed in. I was at the table first. That was normal. I'm always early. I ordered water, straightened my jacket, checked my watch. The restaurant was the kind of place that dims the lights on purpose. Candles, dark wood, menus with no prices on the side they hand the woman. I remember thinking she would love it. I remember feeling good about the night. She walked in at 7:43. I know the exact time because I looked at my watch when I saw her, not because I was tracking her, just a reflex. 7:43, 13 minutes late, which was also normal. She looked good. I want to say that clearly because it matters to what comes next. She had made an effort. Dress I hadn't seen before, hair done differently. The kind of details that tell you someone cared about how they'd be perceived. I noticed. I smiled. I stood up to greet her. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, sat down. And then she said, "I hope you don't mind. I mentioned tonight to Marcus, and he's going to stop by for one drink. Just to be polite. He won't stay long." She said it the way you say something you've already decided. Not a question, not really even an announcement. Just information, delivered with a smile, already past the point where I could object without seeming difficult. I looked at her. She was already opening the menu. "I want to tell you," I said something, "that I set a boundary right there, cleanly, before the night had a chance to become what it became."
But I didn't. I picked up my menu too. I told myself it was one drink, a colleague, a minor interruption to an otherwise good evening. I told myself a lot of things in those first few seconds. What I didn't tell myself, what I wouldn't fully admit until much later, was that something had already shifted. Not dramatically, not with a crash. Just a quiet, internal recalibration. The kind your body does before your mind catches up. The table had been set for 2. Somewhere between her walking in and Marcus arriving, it became a table for 3. And the night I had planned, the one where we looked at each other across candlelight and remembered why we built this life together, that night was already gone. I just hadn't accepted it yet. We met when we were both 26. She was finishing her MBA. I was 2 years into a project management role that paid decent and bored me completely. We met at a work event, not even a good one, just a Thursday evening mixer at a hotel conference room with cheap wine and name tags. She was the only person there who looked like she had somewhere better to be. That was the thing about her back then. She had energy that made rooms feel smaller, not in an overwhelming way, in a way that made you want to stand closer. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. Got married on a Saturday in October, outdoor ceremony, her mother cried, my brother gave a toast that went 4 minutes too long. Normal. Good. Real. The first few years were the years I look back on most. We were broke in the way young married couples are broke, not dangerously, just carefully. We split grocery lists, argued about streaming subscriptions, took one vacation a year and planned it like a military operation. There was friction sometimes, but it was the friction of 2 people figuring each other out. It felt productive. Then her career started moving. She had always been driven. That wasn't new. But there's a difference between ambition that includes you and ambition that begins to replace you. Around year 4, I started feeling the difference. She got promoted to a senior marketing role at a mid-sized firm. Good company, aggressive culture, long hours. She came home later. She talked about work more. Not sharing, exactly, more like processing out loud, and I was the wall she bounced it off. I listened. I supported. I reorganized my own schedule more than once to make her life easier. I told myself that was what partnership looked like. She moved firms 18 months later. Bigger company, bigger title, bigger salary. I was proud of her, genuinely. But the new job came with a new orbit, new colleagues, new social calendar, new expectations about how she spent her time. I started to feel like a supporting role in a story that used to have 2 leads. Marcus came into the picture about 2 years before that anniversary dinner. He was her direct supervisor at the new company. She mentioned him early on the way you mention anyone from work, casually, in passing, just a name attached to a meeting or a decision. But over time, the name started appearing more, in more contexts, with more detail. He was smart, she'd say. He really understood the industry. He pushed her in ways her previous bosses hadn't. I didn't react. There was nothing concrete to react to. But I noticed that when she talked about work now, his name showed up in almost every story. And I noticed that the way she talked about him was different from how she talked about anyone else. There was a specific kind of energy in her voice, lighter, more animated. I filed it away. That's what I did in those years. I observed and I filed things away, and I told myself I was being rational rather than admit I might be afraid of what the files were starting to add up to. We still had good moments. Dinners, weekends, stretches of normalcy where I convinced myself I was imagining the distance.
She still laughed at things I said. We still had a life that looked from the outside completely intact. But somewhere in year 7, I realized I had stopped feeling like her first choice. I hadn't been replaced yet. I just wasn't the priority anymore. I never met Marcus formally until that dinner, but I knew enough. You piece together a person over time without meaning to. A name repeated often enough starts to carry weight. Details accumulate. You build a picture without ever deciding to. From what she had told me, always casually, always as if it were unremarkable, Marcus was 44, divorced once, no kids. He had built his career at a series of aggressive companies and had a reputation for identifying talent and pushing it hard. She framed this as mentorship, as professional investment. She said he saw potential in her that previous managers had overlooked. I didn't argue with that. Maybe it was true. But I had also noticed, over 2 years of listening, that Marcus seemed to have a specific interest in her potential specifically, that the late meetings were more frequent when he was involved, that the work trips, 3 in 18 months, always seemed to align with his schedule, that his name came up not just in professional contexts, but in personal ones. What he thought about a restaurant, what he'd said about a film she mentioned. Small things, consistent things. I want to be clear about something. I had no proof of anything at that point. I wasn't operating on evidence. I was operating on pattern recognition, and patterns can mislead you. So I stayed measured. I asked questions sometimes, light ones. She answered them easily, without defensiveness, which I took as a good sign. She never hid that she respected him. She never pretended he wasn't a significant presence in her professional life. That openness, I told myself, was the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. I wanted to believe that.
The first time I saw him in person was about 6 months before the anniversary dinner. Her company held a quarterly event, informal, spouses invited. A rooftop bar, early evening. The kind of corporate social where everyone is performing relaxation. She introduced us. Marcus was tall, well-dressed without being showy, the kind of man who makes eye contact like he's been trained to. His handshake was firm. His smile arrived quickly and stayed exactly as long as it needed to. He said he'd heard a lot about me. I said something equally neutral back. We spoke for maybe 4 minutes. I watched him more than I participated in the conversation. What I was looking for, I couldn't have named precisely. Some visible sign of threat. Something I could point to and say, there, that's the thing I've been sensing. But there was nothing that obvious. He was polished, professional, careful. That carefulness was the thing that stayed with me afterward. Most people at a social event with a colleague's spouse are either too friendly or slightly awkward. Marcus was neither. He was calibrated. He said the right amount, asked one question about my work, laughed at the right moment, and then gracefully redirected his attention elsewhere. It felt practiced. On the drive home that night, I asked her what she thought of the evening. She said it was fine. Work events were work events. She was glad I came. I asked what she thought of Marcus as a person outside of the office context. She said, he's exactly the same. That's just who he is. I nodded and looked at the road. That answer had bothered me more than I showed. Because in my experience, people who are exactly the same in every context aren't more authentic than everyone else. They're just more controlled. And controlled people always have a reason to be. Marcus arrived at 8:15. He didn't rush in. He appeared. That's the only word that fits.
One moment, the table was 2 people and a quiet tension neither of us had named yet. And then he was standing at the edge of it. Jacket on, no tie, the kind of effortless presentation that takes considerable effort. She saw him before I did. I know because I was watching her. There was a shift in her posture, subtle, involuntary, the kind of physical response you can't manufacture or suppress. Her shoulders lifted slightly. Her chin came up. She smiled before she had even fully turned toward him, which meant the smile wasn't for the moment. It was already waiting. "Marcus, you actually came," she said. Not, "I'm glad you're here." Not, "This is a surprise." You actually came. Like she had hoped but hadn't been sure. Like his presence was a small gift she hadn't let herself count on. He sat down across from her, which put him diagonally from me. He ordered a drink without looking at the menu. He said, "Happy anniversary" to both of us, looked at me when he said it, which I gave him credit for. Then the conversation moved, and I felt it move, like a current that had found its natural direction, and the direction wasn't toward me. I want to describe what the next 40 minutes felt like without overstating it. It wasn't loud. There was no obvious disrespect. If someone at a nearby table had glanced over, they would have seen 3 adults having dinner. Nothing alarming, nothing out of place. But I was at that table, and what I experienced was a conversation happening inside the conversation. 2 people with a shared language, shared references, shared shorthand that I wasn't part of. She laughed at things he said that weren't especially funny. She leaned forward when he spoke. She referenced things, a meeting, a phrase, a moment from a work trip, that landed between them like private signals. I participated when there was an opening. I asked questions, made comments, kept my tone light. I was not ignored. That would have been easier in some ways.
Instead, I was included just enough to maintain the appearance of a group conversation while functionally sitting outside of one. That's a specific kind of invisible. At one point, Marcus asked about my work. I answered. He nodded, made an attentive sound, and within 30 seconds the conversation had returned to their orbit. Not rudely. That's what I kept coming back to. Nothing he did was rude enough to call out. Nothing she did was obvious enough to confront. It was all happening just below the threshold of undeniable. And she knew that threshold. She had always been smart. She knew exactly how much was visible and how much wasn't. What she didn't account for was how well I knew her. 8 years gives you a map of a person. You learn their tells, the specific laugh that means they're performing versus the one that means they're genuinely caught off guard. The way their eyes move when they're interested versus when they're being polite. I had her map. I had memorized it without trying to, the way you memorize the layout of a house you've lived in long enough to walk through in the dark. And everything her body was doing that night was telling me a story her mouth was not. I picked up my glass, I kept my face calm, and I let the night continue. She thought I was looking at the menu. I wasn't. There's a particular angle you learn after years of sitting across from someone at tables, the exact tilt of their wrist, the way their arm shifts when something is happening below the surface. I wasn't looking for it. I just saw it. Her phone was in her lap. Not unusual on its own. People check their phones at dinner. It's a modern habit, barely worth noting. But this was different in a way that took me a moment to identify. She wasn't glancing down between moments. She was managing something. Her thumb was moving.
Her responses to the table conversation had a half-second delay that hadn't been there before, a slight lag between hearing and reacting that meant part of her attention was somewhere else entirely. Marcus was talking about a conference he'd attended. I was listening to him while watching her in my peripheral vision. She typed something, paused, typed again. Then she put the phone face down on her thigh and looked up and laughed at something he just finished saying. I replayed the timing in my head. She hadn't been looking at him when he said it. She had looked up after, which meant the laugh was a response to rejoining the conversation, not to what he'd actually said. A social reflex, a cover. I looked at my plate. Here's what I want to explain carefully, because this moment matters more than it might seem. It wasn't the texting that hit me. People text at dinner. It wasn't even the hiding of the phone, though that registered. What landed, quietly and with full weight, was the prioritization. This was our anniversary dinner. 8 years. A restaurant she had chosen. A date she had marked on the calendar weeks in advance. And in the middle of it, there was something on that phone that required her attention more than the man sitting across from her. That's not about suspicion. That's about value. I had been budgeted a certain amount of her presence that night, and whatever was on that phone was drawing from the same account. Marcus excused himself to take a call outside around 8:40. Brief window, maybe 5 minutes. She picked the phone back up immediately. I watched her read something. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small, private reaction, the corner of her mouth moving in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was close. Whatever she read, she was pleased by it. She typed a response, longer this time.
Then she set the phone down again, took a sip of her wine, and looked out toward the entrance, not at me, with an expression I recognized. It was anticipation. She was waiting for something, or someone's response. The energy she was carrying wasn't the energy of a woman celebrating her marriage. It was the energy of a woman in the middle of something exciting that had nothing to do with the table she was sitting at. Marcus came back. She straightened. The phone stayed face down. I said nothing. I refilled my water glass. I asked the waiter about the specials. I kept the surface of the evening smooth and unremarkable. But underneath that, something had clarified. The night had stopped being about what I'd hoped and had become about something else entirely. Information. I was no longer just a husband at an anniversary dinner. I was someone paying very close attention, and I had barely scratched the surface of what the night still had to show me. It happened during the dessert menu. The waiter had placed them on the table and stepped away. Marcus had leaned forward to say something to her, quiet, meant only for her, the kind of lowered voice that creates a private space inside a public one. She leaned in to hear him, and then he put his hand over hers. Not for long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. A light placement, fingers over knuckles, the kind of touch that has just enough ambiguity to survive denial. He wasn't grabbing her. He wasn't being aggressive. It was the specific kind of physical contact that operates in the space between friendly and something else, close enough to mean something, brief enough to be explained away. She didn't pull back. That's the part I keep returning to. His hand was on hers for 3 or 4 seconds, and she did not move. She smiled at whatever he'd said. She let the moment exist, and then he withdrew his hand naturally and sat back, and the conversation continued like nothing had been inserted into it.
I was looking directly at them when it happened. I don't think either of them registered that. They had stopped fully tracking me some time ago, which was its own kind of answer. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect a specific response. Rage, humiliation, the urge to stand up and make the situation impossible to ignore. But that's not what happened inside me. What I felt was cold. Not the cold of shock. The cold of confirmation. There's a difference. Shock destabilizes you. Confirmation does the opposite. It settles something that has been unsettled for a long time. All the filed observations, the patterns, the small accumulated evidence of the past 2 years, it all aligned in that moment into a single coherent picture. I had not been imagining things. I set my menu down. I looked at the table, at the candle between us, at my wine glass. I took a slow breath, and I made a decision. Not dramatically, not as an act of strategy in that moment, but as a simple recognition of what the situation required. I was not going to react tonight. Not because I was weak, not because I was in denial, but because reacting at that table, in that restaurant, on that night, would have handed both of them something I wasn't willing to give. A scene, a crisis they could manage together, a moment that would become the story, the husband who lost it at dinner, instead of the truth, which was something much larger and much more damaging to the version of events she would eventually try to construct. I had spent 8 years being the reasonable one. I was going to be reasonable one more time. But there was a difference now. Before, my reasonableness had been genuine. Patience, trust, the natural temperament of someone who preferred resolution to conflict. What I was practicing now was something colder. It looked the same from the outside. It felt entirely different from the inside. Marcus ordered dessert.
She declined, said she was watching something, laughed when he told her that was a poor decision. I ordered the chocolate tart. I finished it. I complimented the waiter on the recommendation. And I sat with what I now knew, quietly, while the candle between us burned lower and the evening moved toward its end. Marcus left at 9:52. He shook my hand at the door. Firm grip, direct eye contact. The same calibrated performance from the rooftop bar 6 months ago. He told her he'd see her Monday. He told me it was good to meet me properly. Then he was gone, absorbed into the street, and it was just the two of us for the first time since 7:43. She turned to me with a smile that was slightly too wide. "He's great, right?" she said. "I'm glad you finally got to talk to him properly." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "He seems capable," I said. She accepted that. We settled the bill. She touched my arm on the way out. A light, familiar gesture. The kind of contact that operates on autopilot after enough years together. I didn't pull away. I didn't respond to it either. I just walked beside her to the car. The drive home was 11 minutes. I know because I counted intersections. Not consciously. Just the way your mind finds something mechanical to do when the rest of it is occupied with something it hasn't finished processing. She talked during the drive. About the restaurant. The food had been good. She was glad she'd picked it. About a colleague who had texted her about a project deadline. About something she'd seen online earlier in the week that she'd meant to tell me about. Normal conversation. Easy, surface level. The kind of talking that fills space without requiring much from either person. I responded where responses were needed. Short, functional, unrevealing. She didn't notice anything different. That told me something too.
If she had been fully present, if her attention had been on me the way it should have been on an anniversary, she would have felt the shift. 8 years together, and she would have registered the difference between my normal quiet and this particular quiet. But she didn't register it, because she hadn't been tracking me closely enough that night to notice the change. We got home at 10:20. She went to the bathroom to take off her makeup. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and let myself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, everything I had been holding back since 8:15. Not rage. I want to be clear about that again. Grief, mostly. The specific grief of watching something you built get treated carelessly by the person who was supposed to protect it with you. A sadness with a hard floor. Not bottomless, not desperate, just solid and heavy and real. Then 60 seconds were up, and I put it away. She came out of the bathroom and said she was exhausted. She asked if I was okay. I said yes. She kissed me on the cheek. The same cheek she had kissed when she arrived at the restaurant, and got into bed and was asleep within 20 minutes. I lay beside her in the dark and stared at the ceiling. I was not going to confront her tonight. I was not going to operate on what I had witnessed without knowing what I was actually dealing with. A hand touch and some charged body language were significant, but they were not the whole picture. I had spent 8 years being fair. I was going to be fair one more time, but I was also going to be thorough. She was asleep. I was not. And the night wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go looking for her phone. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how I think about what happened next. I'm not someone who checks phones. In 8 years, I had never once gone through her messages, her emails, her anything.
Not out of naivete, out of a genuine belief that a marriage without trust isn't worth the architecture you build around it. That belief was still intact at 11 p.m. when I got up for water. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. She always plugged it in there overnight, a habit from the early years when we agreed not to have phones in the bedroom. We had kept that rule longer than most couples we knew. I had always thought of it as one of our healthier ones. The screen lit up as I walked past, a message preview, visible without unlocking, without touching. I stopped. The preview showed a name, not Marcus, a name I didn't recognize, and the first line of a message that was friendly in a way that felt immediately wrong. The tone of it, the familiarity, the kind of sentence that assumes a history. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up the phone. It wasn't locked. She had turned off her passcode sometime in the past few months. I hadn't known that. I stood in the kitchen in the dark, and I understood that the absence of a lock wasn't carelessness, it was comfort. She wasn't worried about me looking because she didn't believe I would. She had read me correctly for 8 years. She had miscalculated on year 8. I opened the messages. The name on the preview was a cover. I understood that within 30 seconds. The contact name was a woman's name, someone I vaguely knew as a work friend, but the conversation was not between two women catching up. The language was specific in ways that don't exist between colleagues or friends. Compressed references to time spent together, a particular kind of shorthand, sentences that only make sense if the space between two people has already been closed. I read backward through the thread, 3 months of it. Not explicit, not graphic, and I want to be precise here, because what I found was in some ways harder to dismiss than something obvious would have been.
Explicit content can be framed as a mistake, an impulse, something that got out of hand once. What I was reading was sustained, intentional, emotional. There were inside jokes. There were references to conversations they'd had in person that I hadn't known about. There were moments where she had clearly been with me. A weekend trip we took in January, a Sunday I remembered specifically, and had been narrating it to him in real time. Small observations about our life together, offered to someone else like dispatches from a place she was only partially inhabiting. That was the part that broke something in me. Not the attraction. I could have processed attraction. People feel things they don't act on, and even when they act on them, there's sometimes a version of that story that involves repair. But this was different. This was months of her being mentally elsewhere while standing next to me. Months of our life being background material for a conversation I wasn't part of. The anniversary dinner hadn't been an escalation. It had been a continuation of something already fully in motion. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I went back to bed. I lay down next to her in the dark, and I looked at the ceiling. And I understood with complete clarity that the marriage I thought I was in was not the marriage that had actually existed for the past 3 months, maybe longer. The question of what to do with that was something I would need to be very careful about. I wasn't going to rush it, but I wasn't going to pretend either. I waited 4 days, not out of hesitation, out of preparation. There's a difference between a man who delays a hard conversation because he's afraid of it, and a man who takes the time to know exactly what he's walking into before he opens the door. I needed to be the second kind. I spoke to a lawyer on day 2, a brief consultation, just enough to understand my position, what documentation mattered, what didn't.
I made copies of what I had seen on the phone, not by going through it again, but by trusting my memory and writing down specifics while they were still sharp. Dates, references, enough. On day 4, I came home from work at the normal time. I made dinner. Nothing significant. Pasta. Simple. The kind of meal we'd made 100 times. She came home 40 minutes later, changed out of her work clothes, sat down at the table. We ate. She talked about her day. I listened. After dinner, I cleared the plates, and then I sat back down across from her, and I said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She looked up. Something crossed her face. Not guilt, not yet. More like alertness. The expression of someone whose instincts have fired before their conscious mind is caught up. "Okay," she said. I told her what I had seen. Not everything, not the full inventory of the thread, but enough. The phone preview. The messages. The contact name used as a cover. The 3 months of conversation that told me this wasn't new and wasn't small. I told her about the dinner. The posture shift when he arrived. The phone under the table. The hand. The fact that she had not pulled back. I told her I wasn't angry. That part seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. She started with denial. Not aggressive denial. Careful denial. The kind that looks for the edges of what you actually know so we can operate in the gaps. She said the messages were being misread. That the contact name was exactly who I thought it was. That the dinner had been innocent and I was constructing something out of nothing because I had clearly already decided to be suspicious. I let her finish. Then I told her the specific details I had memorized. The January weekend. The Sunday I could name precisely.
the phrases that don't exist between people who are only colleagues. The denial shifted. She moved to minimization. It wasn't what it looked like.
It was emotional, not physical. She had been going through something, and he had been available in a way that... She stopped herself there, but the sentence had already shown me its shape. He had been available in a way that I hadn't been. That was the confession inside the non-confession. I asked her one question. Did you want to save this marriage before tonight, or have you already decided? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the table. She turned her wine glass once, slowly, the way she does when she's buying time to find the right words. And then she said, "I don't know." 3 words, but the way she said them, not broken, not desperate, not the response of someone terrified of losing what they had, told me the answer was closer to no than she was willing to say out loud yet. I nodded. I told her I appreciated the honesty. I told her I wasn't going to beg, and I wasn't going to perform anger for her benefit. I told her I had already spoken to a lawyer, and that I wanted the process to be clean and fair for both of us. She looked at me like she was seeing someone she didn't fully recognize. Maybe she was. The man she had married would have fought harder in that moment, would have pushed for the explanation, the apology, the path back to intact. That man had believed that effort and reasonableness could hold almost anything together. This man had done the math, and the numbers didn't work anymore. 11:34 a.m. The paperwork took 4 months. Not because it was complicated, because these things move at their own pace, regardless of how clear the decision is. You sign things, you wait, you sign more things. The machinery of legally separating 2 lives runs on its own timeline, and there's nothing to do but stay functional inside it. She moved out 3 weeks after the conversation. We were civil. I want to say that because it matters. There was no warfare, no scorched earth, no campaign to make the other person's life difficult. We divided things reasonably. She took what was hers. I kept what was mine. The things that had been ours we handled one by one, without much argument. That civility cost me something, I think. Not in a practical sense. But grief needs edges to push against, and when everything is handled calmly, it can be hard to find the places where you're allowed to fall apart. I stayed functional for so long that the falling apart happened in smaller, quieter ways. 3 a.m, a Tuesday, a song on the radio I hadn't heard in years. Marcus, as far as I know, did not become the next chapter of her story. I heard through a mutual contact months later that things between them had complicated once the professional distance collapsed. I wasn't surprised. Some connections exist specifically in the tension of what they can't be. Remove the boundary, and the thing that made it charged disappears with it. I don't know what she felt about that. I stopped being the person she told things to. The house sold in month 5. I had expected that to be the hardest moment, standing in empty rooms where our life had been arranged, but it wasn't. By then, enough time had passed that the rooms just looked like rooms. The life we had lived in them had already relocated to memory, and memory I could manage. I want to talk about the anger because people always ask about the anger. Yes, it was there. It would be dishonest to say otherwise. There were days when what I felt was not grief or sadness, but a clean burning fury at the specific nature of the betrayal. Not just the acts themselves, but the duration, the concealment, the way she had stood next to me for months while being somewhere else entirely. The January weekend, the Sunday I could name. Those details didn't soften with time. They stayed sharp. But I had made a decision early on not to let the anger become the loudest thing in the room. Not for her sake, for mine.
Anger that size, if you feed it, starts to organize your whole life around the person who caused it. And I was not willing to let her, or Marcus, or the version of those 3 months become the architecture of whatever came next for me. That was the one thing I could control when almost nothing else felt controllable. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday. I remember it was raining. I remember signing the last document and sitting in my car in the parking lot of the attorney's office for about 10 minutes before driving home. Not crying, not relieved, just still. The particular stillness of something being genuinely over. 8 years. Not wasted, I don't believe that. We had built real things together, and some of those things still stood, just in different forms now. But finished. Closed. The version of my life that had included her was done. I drove home, I made dinner. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. And the next morning I got up and I moved forward. Not because it was easy, but because forward was the only direction that had anything in it. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Silence is not the same as peace. For most of our marriage, I had confused the two. I kept things calm. I absorbed friction. I filed observations away instead of speaking them because I told myself that was maturity, that was partnership, that was the long game of keeping something intact. But there's a version of silence that protects a relationship, and a version that slowly erases you from it. I had been practicing the second kind for longer than I wanted to admit. The red flags I had filed away, the name that appeared too often, the energy shift I noticed and then talked myself out of noticing, the rooftop bar where I watched him be carefully calibrated and came home and said nothing. Those weren't moments of patience. They were moments where I chose comfort over clarity, where I decided that not knowing for certain was preferable to knowing and having to.
That's not strength. That's avoidance with good posture. I'm not saying I caused what she did. I want to be precise about that. The choices she made were hers. The months of concealment, the redirected emotional investment, the hand she didn't pull back, those belong to her completely. Accountability doesn't transfer. But I had my own accounting to do. I had spent years making myself smaller to keep the peace and calling it love. I had reorganized my schedule, my needs, my voice, and framed it as support when some of it was just fear. Fear that asking for more would make me difficult. Fear that naming what I saw would make it real. Fear that the version of us I wanted to believe in couldn't survive honest contact with the version that actually existed. That fear was mine, and it had cost me. What I learned, slowly, imperfectly, across the months that followed, was the difference between being easygoing and being absent. I had been so committed to not being the problem that I had stopped being fully present. And a person who is never fully present in their own marriage creates a kind of vacancy. Not an excuse for betrayal, just a condition worth understanding. I also learned something about letting nights play out. There is a version of that choice, staying quiet at the dinner, observing, not reacting, that is strategic and self-possessed. That version is real. I meant it. I'm not going to pretend I was purely passive. But there is also a version of letting things play out that is just another name for hoping you're wrong, for giving something one more chance to not be what it looks like. I was doing both of that table simultaneously, and I think that's an honest thing to say. The ending I got was not a revenge story, no dramatic public reckoning, no moment where the truth landed on her like consequence from a height. Just a quiet dinner, 4 days of preparation, a conversation at a kitchen table, and 4 months of paperwork. Undramatic, final. Mine. If there's a lesson in it, and I'm careful about lessons because real situations resist clean packaging, it's this. Pay attention to what you file away and never address. Pay attention to the places where you go quiet to keep someone else comfortable. Pay attention early when the cost of clarity is still manageable. Because the longer you wait, the more the silence costs. And some silences, once they've grown large enough, stop being something you chose. They become something you live inside.